Thank you for joining me today as I talk open source, how open source software came about, what it is, what it isn't, what it solves, and why you should get involved. I'm Rachel Pescador, Director of Content at Yugabyte. I first got involved in open source around 4 years ago when I joined Percona and gained an appreciation for the values and ethos of open source. I've spent countless hours writing about open source software and community values. Yugabyte's commitment to open source was a major part of my decision to join the company a year ago. As I'm sure you're all aware, open source software is a popular choice for development and infrastructure. Open source solutions lead the way in programming languages, operating systems, databases, and even the cloud native space. I'm going to start from the very beginning, the very beginning. The concept of free sharing of technological information existed long before computers. Did you know that Aculean stone tools, or hand axes as they're rather more widely known, are over 1.5 million years old? Created and used by our ancestors, they represent the first great technological leap of humanity. Their widespread use across the globe indicates that tribes would have shared their skills and that groups refined and improved the original design over thousands and thousands of years. Perhaps this is the first example of open source in action. Moving forward in time, just a little, to more modern technology. In the 1950s and 60s, computer systems and compilers were delivered as part of hardware purchases without additional fees. As early adopters of computing technology, universities developed and openly shared their software modifications in keeping with the academic principles of sharing knowledge. As large-scale operating systems matured, fewer organizations allowed software modification, and eventually operating systems became closed. Software actually wasn't copyrightable until 1974, when the US Commission on New Technological Uses of Copyrighted Works, which is definitely a mouthful, declared that computer programs could be subject to copyright. Before that, there were no licenses attached to software, and it was shared as public domain software, which could be modified, distributed, or sold without attribution. The 1974 decision, along with other court decisions around that time, gave computer programs the copyright status of literary works. And this kick-started licensing of software and the closed source software business model. In the 1970s and early 80s, computer vendors and software companies began to charge for software licenses. They promoted software as program products and imposed legal restrictions on new software developments via copyrights, trademarks, and leasing contracts. Software companies stopped distributing source code and only distributed the executable machine code. Computer programmer Richard Stallman was ethically opposed to this and founded a free software collaboration project called the Gnu Project in 1983. Its goal was to give computer users freedom and control of their computer use by collaboratively developing and publishing software that was free to run, free to copy, free to distribute, and free to modify. In 1991, the Linux kernel was released as freely modifiable source code. The GNU operating system, combined with the Linux kernel, brought about the first complete free software operating system. As website-based companies rose to prominence in the mid-90s, free software became a popular choice for web servers. Systems were based on a common stack of software. The LAMP system included the Linux kernel at the base, Apache providing web services, the MySQL database engine for data storage, and the PHP programming language for dynamic pages. The term open source was suggested at a meeting in Palo Alto in January 1998 and rapidly spread through the community. And of course, all of you here today now use that term. Soon after that, the Open Source Initiative was formed to educate about and advocate for the benefits of open source. When the dot-com bubble, it's very hard to say those words, by the way, burst in 2000, funding dried up, and many dot-com companies ran out of capital and went through liquidation. At this time, open source software offered a cheap way for startups to innovate, and open source became increasingly popular and widely used. But you might ask, what's in it for companies using open source? What's in it for vendors? And how do you actually sustain open source? Well, first, let's talk about why open source is popular with users. And I've given you 4 of what I would see as being the main reasons. One of the main advantages of open source is the low startup effort and cost. It's easy to get online, download software for free and start using it. As it's free, if you decide that software isn't quite the right fit for your business, it's easy to switch to something else without constraint or cost, unlike proprietary software. Secondly, another reason for the popularity of open source is people wanting to avoid vendor lock-in. Vendor lock-in is always a risk when you depend upon a specific provider for proprietary software or services. When you decide to explore other software options, it can be impossible to move without significant cost or business disruption. Fees can be a big issue here. You have to pay fees for a premium or enterprise software solution. And over time, this can become a significant outlay for your business. Prices often start fairly reasonably, but you don't have much longer-term control over costs, which can increase due to annual bumps, your own business growth, or even newly introduced features which you might not want to use. You're in a poor negotiating position. Vendors make it very hard for you to leave, and they rely on the fact that moving potentially incurs significant costs and business disruption. In most cases, companies tied to a vendor haven't much choice but to suck up any price hikes. You might end up tied to a technology which just isn't the best fit for your business. Technology solutions, all different, just like individual business needs. But when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You might end up using software that isn't the best fit for the job, just to make the most out of your investment. Finally, you could miss out on new features. If you're tied to a single vendor, you could miss out on transformational features or trends that just aren't on their radar or aren't a priority for them. Being able to easily switch or embrace alternative options allows you to stay ahead of your competition. Luckily, there are tons of open source options on the market. So if you take the time to match your business requirements with the right open source software, you can access the enterprise features you need without the proprietary software costs. Thirdly, another reason users love open source is that it isn't dependent on just one person. There's a community of people actively contributing and supporting the project, bringing diverse ideas and innovations and suggesting new features. Finally, trust. It's not all locked away. You can get in, look at the source code, check it's secure, dig around and see that it does what it needs to. The other side of the coin is why open source is popular with vendors and why do they want to open source their software? Well, this is a cyclical process and each part relies on the other. So I hope at this point you'll all admire my lovely illustration. By making software freely available, it's downloaded and deployed widely. And this means that more people use it, like it, test it, which gives you rapid feedback. That feedback improves the quality of the software. People using the software make software contributions, feature requests, and product improvement ideas. And this means the product gets better. By making this high quality software freely available, it's downloaded and deployed freely, and so on in a circle. So each part depends on the next part and the part before. But you know, is open source really as open as some companies claim? Today, open source software is a popular choice. In fact, it's so popular with users that some companies claim their software is open source, even though it isn't really. As the term open source isn't trademarked, any company can use it to describe their software without too many consequences. And some companies have a flexible approach to the term open source and use it despite their software not entirely meeting the open source software principles defined by the OSI. The principles of open source, of course, are all well and good, but obviously open source isn't a charity. Commercially viable open source is really important for long-term project success. So how can vendors make it commercially viable while keeping to open source principles? Well, here are some models. I've given you three that I think are the key ones to think about. Firstly, build and offer support and services on top of the open source. Red Hat's a classic example of adding support and services around Linux. Secondly, open core, and I'll come to that in a minute, so just bear with me for the next couple of slides. And then three, database as a service, also known as DBaaS. This is probably the most recent method and involves vendors offering a cloud version of their software for companies requiring organizational simplicity. Yugabyte saw a need for this and actually offer Yugabyte DB Managed, which is fully managed Yugabyte DB as a service. Going back to the second option from my previous slide, open core. Open core is often marketed as open source software. It usually applies when there's an open source or community software version, plus a proprietary enterprise version with additional features. The community version's generally used as a taster or a hook and has limited features, with the aim being to drive people to use that paid enterprise version. The community version can also end up being underinvested in, not actively maintained, or sometimes even actively hamstrung because the vendors really want you to choose that shiny enterprise version. The good thing about open source, especially for popular software, is that there are often a variety of alternative options available, which should include the enterprise features you want for free. Another description companies use is open source compatible. But again, this isn't really open source software. Instead, it generally means that it's easy to migrate from open source to a proprietary technology, but very hard to leave. Even if the core engine is exactly the same as the open source version, additional features will be proprietary. Your team may start to rely on these tools and find that when you try to leave, there isn't a like-for-like open source version that you can easily switch to. As long as you understand that this is proprietary software and not open source, despite the name, and that works for you, then great, have at it. But if you want to eventually move to a fully open source alternative, you need to bear this in mind when you're adopting features that could be very hard to leave. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about source available software, and I'm also going to give you a couple of examples of software licenses that do meet the Open Source Initiative, the OSI criteria for open source. So source available is a class of licenses that give you access to the source code but come with some restrictions. Some open source vendors, worried about losing business to large cloud vendors, adopted open source licenses to prevent this. Open source licenses are usually designed to restrict competition, which is good for vendors, but not so good for people hoping to find open source alternatives and avoid vendor lock-in. There was a really great article a couple of weeks ago by Lindsay Clark in the Register, and I will drop it into the chat so that you can see. This looked at open source licensing terms and spoke to the key players in the database market. And in the article, it discussed these players. So MariaDB and CockroachDB have adopted a business source license, BSL. MariaDB claims that this is a new alternative to closed source or open core licensing models. So with BSL, the source code is always publicly available and non-production use of the code is always free. And the licensor can also make an additional use grant allowing limited production use. Source code is guaranteed to become open source at a certain point in time. BSL licenses basically promise open source eventually. Over time, features will make it into the open source version, but in practice, this means that it's only outdated software that becomes open source. Another alternative, the server-side public license, SSPL, was introduced by MongoDB. This requires enhancements to MongoDB be released to the community. The restrictions stop companies from offering MongoDB as a managed service to other users. Neither SSPL or BSL meet all of the criteria for open source software set out by the OSI. However, it's worth mentioning that open source licenses vary wildly. It's worth mentioning that source available licenses can vary wildly. Some meet most of the criteria set out by the OSI, others only allow you to review source code. Fundamentally, though, a source available license is still a proprietary license. It's not open source. Here, I've given you some examples. So examples of true open source licenses include GPL and Apache 2, which is shown in the slide. So now, just a few thoughts on Yugabyte's approach to open source. As you know, you might have mentioned them as part of this event. You might not know this, but Yugabyte DB actually started out as open core in 2016. It's been available since July 2019 under the Apache 2 permissive free software license. Switching opened up previously closed source enterprise features such as distributed backups, data encryption, and read replicas, and ensured that any new features were completely free to use. This move actually goes against the recent trend of several database and data infrastructure companies abandoning open source licenses for some or all of their core project. In fairness, the Yugabyte founders had originally wanted to be fully open source, but were persuaded to go open core instead. But after the software, Yugabyte DB, gained traction with early customers, the leadership team realized that being competitive on the DBAS was as important as being competitive on important as being competitive on the database, and that customers wanted the database to be open source. So they decided to make the change to open source and never look back. Finally, I know that you are sorry that I've got to finally already, but you know, all good things must come to an end. What are the main benefits of open source software? Well, a key benefit is the community. A thriving community is an essential part of any open source software project. In fact, many projects would probably say community is the key driver of their success, contributing code, ideas and innovation, identifying and fixing bugs, championing the project externally, and being invested in the success of the project. The presence of an informed and responsive community is highly desirable for enterprises considering adoption of a new technology. Because it's great to know that there's a group of dedicated individuals on hand to ask advice of and to help answer questions. Open source communities are not constrained by location, age, gender, race, religion, life experience, or any other of the things that make up our world. In fact, diversity is desirable as it leads to greater innovation and new ideas. As well as learning more about the code and the software, being part of a community helps with personal development. It teaches people to work with others who might have a different and sometimes, perhaps even often, opposing views. It also gives you transferable skills for the future. Many companies are keen to employ open source contributors and people who've taken the time to immerse themselves in a new technology. At Yugabyte, we are very keen to help our community develop and grow personally and in their careers. Our free Yugabyte University courses and training provides official certification for completed courses and has nearly 10,000 users and 16,000 class enrollments. We also have over 6,500 members in our active Yugabyte DB Slack community. Anyone who's been part of a strong open source community will recognize the power of working with a diverse range of people towards a common goal, building lifelong friendships along the way. And of course, one of the best things about community, loads of really cool swag, which, you know, we're always looking for ideas, so feel free to drop them in the chat. So whether you're a beginner or an old hand, here are 5 ways that you can contribute. All of this helps make an open source project better. It's also pretty cool to see your contribution being used. Just to give you a practical example, a recent contribution that made it into Yugabyte DB 2.11 was foreign data wrappers. And this feature was built by Yugabyte DB open source community contributor Radek Gryczolski from Clario. So here you can see on the list, these are 5 ways you can contribute. And I think part of it is just getting involved, ask questions on forums, answer questions that you know the answer to, guide new people, say hello, create tutorials and sample applications. There's been some really cool things floating around on LinkedIn and YouTube recently that have given some brilliant examples of how Yugabyte works for particular use cases. And people are really interested in that. Another thing is, you know, open issues on GitHub for bugs or make evolution requests and contribute to documentation. All these things just help to make the project better. And that's what we're all aiming for, to make the core software better. So we're coming to the end. I'm just going to give you a short recap of the benefits of using open source software. Genuine open source software should save you money, actively deter vendor lock-in, and increase technological agility as it gives businesses the freedom to try new and innovative software options. If you decide you want to move to another vendor, open source software allows you to take your data and move it without hassle and without needing to recode or go through a costly migration process. And just to turn back to the Stone Age for a moment, history has shown that the power of collaboration, community, and the open sourcing of ideas is essential to the next wave of technological innovation. Right now is a really exciting time to be part of it. And we do hope that you will continue and start to contribute to Yugabyte DB. Thank you very much for joining me today on my whistle-stop tour through open source database software. Obviously, there's a ton that I haven't got into. So if you're interested in learning more about open source and Yugabyte DB, you can check out our active Yugabyte DB Slack community or sign up for free training via Yugabyte University. There's also, if you're interested, take a look at the agenda as there are some live Yugabyte University courses running during the event. And remember, you can download Yugabyte DB for free and start poking around, see how it works for you. We also have loads of great explainer videos and demos on our YouTube page and tons of cool blogs. So I'll share the link to that in the chat shortly too. Thank you very much for joining me today, and enjoy the rest of DSS. I would love to hear in the chat if you have any questions, and please do take the time to look at the agenda and see what else is out there that might be of interest. Thank you.